Consider this dilemma. A practice widely accepted in one culture is deemed morally abhorrent in another. Cultural relativists claim both views are equally valid, that morality is merely a product of social conditioning with no universal foundation. But this perspective, however tolerant it may appear, leads to a profound philosophical catastrophe, the complete destruction of genuine morality itself. During my years developing the critical system in Königsberg, I discovered that if we surrender the possibility of universal moral principles, we abandon the very essence of what makes us rational beings. When we reduce ethics to mere cultural preferences, we transform human dignity into a negotiable commodity and render moral progress impossible. The question before us is not whether different cultures have different practices, that much is obvious. The crucial question is whether these differences prove that no universal moral principles exist, or whether they simply demonstrate how inadequately most societies have applied the demands of practical reason. Today, we shall examine why cultural relativism, despite its apparent sophistication, actually represents a retreat from moral reasoning into arbitrary preference, and why only universal principles grounded in reason can preserve the foundation of genuine ethical life. Chapter 1: The Fatal Flaw in Relativism's Foundation. The fundamental error of cultural relativism lies in its confusion between descriptive and normative claims. When relativists observe that different cultures have different moral practices, they commit what I call the descriptive fallacy, assuming that because moral beliefs vary, therefore no objective moral truths exist. This reasoning is as flawed as concluding that because people disagree about mathematical theorems, mathematics itself has no objective foundation. Consider the logical structure of the relativist argument. They claim that moral judgments are valid only within their cultural context, but this very claim itself purports to be universally true. The relativist insists we should respect all cultural perspectives equally, but why should we accept this principle? If it's merely their cultural preference, inhabitants of other cultures are free to reject it. If it's a universal moral truth, then relativism contradicts its own foundation. This contradiction reveals the deeper problem: relativism cannot account for its own normative force. When relativists argue we ought to be tolerant of cultural differences, they smuggle in precisely the kind of universal moral principle they claim doesn't exist. They cannot explain why tolerance is preferable to intolerance without appealing to reasons that transcend particular cultural contexts. Moreover, relativism renders moral criticism impossible. If Nazi practices were simply expressions of German culture in the 1930s, and resistance efforts represented Allied cultural preferences, on what grounds could we declare one superior to the other? The relativist has no principled way to distinguish between progressive moral reform and mere cultural change. They cannot explain why abolishing slavery represented moral progress rather than simply a shift in cultural preferences. The critical examination of relativism reveals it as a form of intellectual surrender, an abandonment of reason's capacity to legislate universal principles in favor of arbitrary cultural authority. This represents not philosophical sophistication but a retreat from the fundamental task of practical reason, discovering what we ought to do regardless of what our particular society happens to prefer. Only by recognizing this fatal flaw can we begin to understand why genuine morality requires universal foundations that transcend the contingencies of cultural circumstance. Chapter 2: How Cultural Variation Actually Supports Universal Principles. The existence of cultural variation in moral practices, rather than disproving universal principles, actually demonstrates their necessity and reveals how inadequately most societies have applied rational moral analysis. When we examine cultural differences through the lens of the categorical imperative, we discover that apparent moral disagreements often mask deeper agreement about fundamental principles. Consider the universal prohibition against unprovoked killing. While cultures differ dramatically in defining who counts as a person deserving moral consideration, some excluding foreigners, slaves, or women, they nevertheless recognize the basic principle that persons should not be killed without justification. The variation lies not in rejection of the principle itself, but in its faulty application due to inadequate concepts of human dignity and rational autonomy. Similarly, every culture recognizes some form of truth-telling obligation, even while they differ about when deception is permissible. These differences reflect varying judgments about how to apply universal principles in complex circumstances, not fundamental disagreement about whether honesty has moral significance. The categorical imperatives universalization test reveals why truth-telling must be a universal duty. A world where lying was universally practiced would be self-contradictory, as the very concept of communication would collapse. The diversity of cultural practices concerning property, family relations, and political authority similarly reflects different attempts to organize social life in ways that respect human dignity and rational autonomy. Some attempts succeed better than others in actualizing these universal demands. A culture that treats women as property fails to recognize their rational nature. A society that practices slavery treats humans merely as means rather than ends in themselves. This analysis reveals why cultural relativism actually undermines moral progress. If all cultural practices are equally valid, we cannot distinguish between societies that better or worse approximate the demands of practical reason. We lose the capacity to criticize practices like female genital mutilation, honor killings, or systematic oppression, not because these practices represent different but equally valid approaches to morality, but because relativism abandons the rational tools necessary for moral evaluation. The existence of moral reformers within cultures proves that individuals can transcend their social conditioning through rational reflection. When someone like Frederick Douglass criticized slavery, or when Wollstonecraft challenged women's subordination, they appealed to universal principles of human dignity that transcended their particular cultural contexts. Their moral authority derived not from expressing cultural preferences, but from applying rational analysis to reveal contradictions between professed principles and actual practices. Cultural variation thus supports rather than undermines universal morality by demonstrating both the universality of basic moral intuitions and the urgent need for critical philosophical analysis to purify these intuitions of cultural distortions and prejudices. Chapter 3: The Universalization Test Destroys Relativist Claims. The categorical imperatives universalization formula provides a decisive refutation of cultural relativism by revealing the rational incoherence of treating cultural practice as the ultimate source of moral authority. When we apply the test, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, relativism fails catastrophically. Consider the maxim that cultural relativists must accept: I should follow the moral practices of my culture simply because they are my culture's practices. Can this principle be universalized? If everyone followed this maxim, moral evaluation would become impossible. No one could ever criticize harmful cultural practices, no matter how destructive. Slavery, genocide, systematic oppression, all would be beyond moral critique if they enjoyed cultural endorsement. This universalization reveals relativism's practical contradiction. The relativist simultaneously claims that, 1. We should respect all cultural practices equally, and 2. We should adopt relativism itself as our approach to ethics. But why should someone from a culture that believes in universal moral truths abandon their cultural practice of moral criticism in favor of relativist tolerance? The relativist cannot answer this question without contradicting their own position. Furthermore, the universalization test exposes how relativism makes rational moral dialogue impossible. If moral judgments are valid only within cultural boundaries, cross-cultural moral discussion becomes meaningless. We could never learn from other cultures' moral insights or challenge our own cultural blind spots. The very possibility of moral progress through reasoned argument would disappear. This is our first natural engagement moment, examine how you treat moral disagreements with people from different backgrounds. Do you assume their perspectives are merely expressions of cultural conditioning, or do you engage their arguments on rational grounds? The relativist approach eliminates the possibility of genuine moral dialogue by reducing all moral claims to expressions of cultural preference rather than reasons that demand rational evaluation. The universalization test also reveals why relativism undermines human dignity. If moral principles derive their authority solely from cultural endorsement, then humans become subject to arbitrary cultural forces rather than autonomous rational agents capable of moral self-determination. The relativist reduces persons to products of their cultural environment, denying their capacity to transcend social conditioning through rational reflection. Consider how this applies to practices like arranged marriage or restrictions on women's education. The relativist must accept these practices as morally valid if they enjoy cultural support, regardless of whether they respect women's rational autonomy. But this treats women merely as means to cultural preservation rather than ends in themselves deserving respect as rational beings. The categorical imperative demands that we treat humanity, whether in our own person or that of another, always as an end and never merely as means. Cultural practices that violate this principle cannot be justified by cultural endorsement alone, they require rational justification that respects human dignity. Chapter 4: Goodwill versus Cultural Conditioning. The distinction between acting from duty and acting merely in accordance with duty reveals why cultural conditioning cannot serve as the foundation for genuine moral worth. When someone follows cultural practices simply because that's how we do things, they act in accordance with duty at best, but lack the goodwill that gives actions genuine moral value. Consider someone who refuses to lie because their culture strongly condemns dishonesty. Their action conforms to moral duty, but its motivation remains heteronomous, determined by external cultural authority rather than autonomous rational reflection. The moral worth of their action depends entirely on whether their culture happens to endorse principles that align with the categorical imperative. In a culture that encouraged strategic deception, the same person would lie without moral qualms. Contrast this with someone who refuses to lie because they recognize that dishonesty cannot be universalized without contradiction. This person acts from duty, from recognition of moral law's rational authority rather than submission to cultural pressure. Their goodwill provides a stable foundation for moral action that transcends cultural variation and personal inclination. This difference becomes crucial when cultural practices conflict with rational moral demands. History provides countless examples of individuals who recognized moral obligations that contradicted their cultural inheritance: abolitionists who opposed slavery despite cultural acceptance, conscientious objectors who refused military service despite patriotic pressure, civil rights activists who challenged segregation despite legal sanction. These moral heroes demonstrate that genuine moral motivation must be distinguished from cultural conformity. They acted from recognition of universal principles that demanded respect for human dignity, even when such recognition required opposing powerful cultural forces. Their moral authority derived not from cultural endorsement but from rational analysis of what morality demands. The analysis of goodwill also reveals why relativism eliminates the possibility of moral education and development. If cultural practices provide the ultimate standard for moral judgment, individuals have no reason to question their cultural inheritance or seek moral improvement through rational reflection. Moral education becomes mere cultural transmission rather than development of critical reasoning capacity. But genuine moral development requires learning to distinguish between actions that happen to accord with duty and actions motivated by recognition of duty's rational foundation. This distinction enables individuals to maintain moral integrity even when cultural pressures encourage moral compromise. Someone who understands why honesty is rationally required can maintain truthfulness even in cultures that reward strategic deception. Furthermore, The focus on goodwill explains why cultural diversity in moral practices need not threaten universal principles. Different cultures may express respect for human dignity through varying specific practices, but the underlying motivation, recognition of rational beings' inherent worth, remains constant. Cultural variation in implementation does not negate the universal principle that provides these practices their moral foundation. The critical examination of motivation thus demonstrates that while cultural influences shape our moral sensibilities, they cannot replace the autonomous rational reflection that constitutes genuine moral agency. Only when we act from recognition of universal principles rather than mere cultural conformity do our actions possess the moral worth that elevates human behavior above mere animal conditioning. Chapter 5: Freedom Requires Universal Moral Law. The relationship between moral freedom and universal law reveals the deepest philosophical error in cultural relativism, its fundamental misunderstanding of what human freedom actually requires. Relativists often present their position as defending cultural freedom against universal moral tyranny, but this completely inverts the relationship between freedom and law in rational beings. True freedom cannot consist in liberation from all law, for that would reduce human action to mere arbitrary choice or natural causation. When someone acts purely from inclination or cultural conditioning, they remain subject to forces beyond their rational control. The person who follows cultural practices simply because that's what everyone does exercises no more genuine freedom than someone driven by hunger or fear. Rational freedom emerges only when we act according to laws we give ourselves through reason. The categorical imperative represents not external constraint but the expression of our deepest freedom, the capacity to determine our actions through rational principles rather than heteronomous forces. When I act from duty, I act according to laws that my own reason recognizes as necessary and universal. This is our second engagement moment. Reflect on your most meaningful moral decisions. Did they involve conforming to social expectations? Or did they require recognizing moral demands that transcended particular cultural contexts? Genuine moral agency manifests when we acknowledge obligations that bind us as rational beings, regardless of cultural variation or personal preference. The antinomy between freedom and determinism resolves itself when we distinguish between the sensible and intelligible worlds. In the sensible realm, cultural practices and biological drives shape human behavior according to causal necessity. But in the intelligible realm, rational beings possess the capacity to act according to moral law that transcends empirical conditioning. Cultural relativism traps human beings entirely within the sensible world by making cultural practices the ultimate source of moral authority. It denies the intelligible dimension of human existence, our capacity to transcend cultural limitations through rational reflection. This reduction of humans to products of cultural forces eliminates precisely what makes moral responsibility possible. Consider how this applies to moral progress. If cultural practices provide the ultimate standard for moral judgment, how could abolitionists have been justified in opposing slavery? How could women's rights advocates challenge patriarchal cultural traditions? The relativist cannot explain moral progress without appealing to standards that transcend particular cultural contexts. But rational moral freedom explains how individuals can recognize moral obligations that conflict with cultural inheritance. When Frederick Douglass argued against slavery, he appealed to universal principles of human dignity that transcended both slave-owning and abolitionist cultures. His moral authority derived from rational recognition of principles that bind all rational beings, regardless of cultural circumstance. The universality of moral law thus supports rather than threatens human freedom by providing the rational foundation necessary for genuine moral agency. Only when we recognize obligations that transcend cultural variation can we distinguish between actions that express rational autonomy and actions that merely reflect cultural conditioning. This analysis reveals why cultural relativism, despite its appearance of tolerance and freedom, actually represents a form of moral slavery, subjection to arbitrary cultural forces rather than autonomous rational self-determination. Genuine freedom requires the capacity to critically evaluate cultural practices against universal principles that respect the dignity of all rational beings. Chapter 6. The postulates prove morality's rational foundation. The postulates of practical reason, freedom, immortality, and God's existence demonstrate why moral philosophy cannot retreat into cultural relativism without abandoning the rational foundations that make morality coherent. These postulates reveal necessary presuppositions of genuine moral thinking that transcend particular cultural contexts and establish the metaphysical framework within which ethical life becomes possible. The postulate of freedom proves most crucial for refuting relativism. Moral responsibility requires that rational beings possess the capacity to act according to principles they recognize through reason, rather than being merely products of cultural conditioning. If human behavior resulted entirely from cultural forces, moral praise and blame would become meaningless. We could no more hold someone morally responsible for following cultural practices than we could blame a stone for falling. But practical reason reveals that moral obligation implies moral capacity. The fact that we experience moral duties, obligations that bind us regardless of inclination or cultural pressure, demonstrates our freedom from merely empirical determination. This freedom manifests not as liberation from all law, but as the capacity to act according to rational principles that we legislate for ourselves as autonomous moral agents. Cultural relativism denies this freedom by making cultural practices the ultimate source of moral authority. It reduces human beings to products of their cultural environment, eliminating the rational autonomy that moral responsibility presupposes. The relativist cannot explain why anyone should feel guilt for violating cultural norms or pride for moral courage, since these emotions presuppose the freedom that relativism denies. The postulate of immortality addresses the relationship between virtue and happiness that cultural practices often obscure. Many cultures reward vice and punish virtue, suggesting that moral behavior lacks rational justification. But practical reason reveals that virtue deserves happiness, even when empirical circumstances deny this connection. The rational hope for ultimate justice provides moral motivation that transcends cultural rewards and punishments. Relativism cannot account for this moral hope because it reduces ethics to cultural practices that may or may not promote human flourishing. If moral principles derive their authority solely from cultural endorsement, we have no rational basis for expecting virtue to be ultimately rewarded. Cultural practices might encourage behavior that makes individuals and societies miserable without any rational ground for moral complaint. The postulate of God's existence reveals the systematic unity that connects moral law with the possibility of genuine moral community. Rational beings who recognize universal moral principles can cooperate in building ethical communities that transcend cultural boundaries. This possibility requires a systematic connection between moral virtue and ultimate justice that finite rational beings cannot guarantee independently. Cultural relativism fragments humanity into isolated cultural groups with incompatible moral systems, eliminating the possibility of genuine moral community. If cultures cannot share common moral principles, cross-cultural cooperation becomes merely strategic alliance rather than ethical partnership. The relativist has no resources for building institutions that serve universal human dignity rather than particular cultural interests. These postulates thus demonstrate that genuine moral thinking requires metaphysical commitments that transcend cultural variation. They reveal why practical reason cannot retreat into relativistic skepticism without abandoning the rational foundations that make ethical life possible. Only by recognizing these necessary presuppositions can we maintain the philosophical coherence required for serious moral reflection and cross-cultural ethical dialogue. Chapter 7. Contemporary Applications, When Cultures Collide. The collision between universal moral principles and cultural practices in contemporary American society reveals the practical urgency of rejecting relativism in favor of rational moral analysis. Consider current debates about religious freedom, women's rights, LGBTQ+ equality, and immigration policy. All involve conflicts between cultural traditions and universal principles of human dignity that demand philosophical resolution rather than relativistic evasion. Take the controversy over religious practices that restrict women's autonomy. Cultural relativists argue we should respect these traditions as expressions of authentic cultural identity, avoiding cultural imperialism by imposing external moral standards. But this analysis fails catastrophically when subjected to categorical imperative testing. Can we universalize the principle that religious or cultural traditions justify denying women equal rational autonomy? Obviously not, since this would treat women merely as means to cultural preservation rather than ends in themselves. The Kantian analysis reveals that authentic respect for cultural diversity requires distinguishing between cultural practices that express universal principles in particular contexts and those that violate human dignity regardless of cultural endorsement. A religious tradition that encourages charitable giving expresses universal moral principles through particular cultural forms. A tradition that denies women education treats them as less than fully rational beings, violating their inherent dignity regardless of cultural sanction. Consider contemporary debates about hate speech and free expression. Relativists often argue that different cultures have different approaches to balancing individual liberty against community harmony, with no universal standard for evaluation. But practical reason reveals that genuine respect for rational autonomy requires protecting the conditions necessary for moral self-determination, including access to information and freedom of conscience. Cultural practices that systematically deny these conditions cannot be justified by cultural endorsement alone. The immigration debate similarly requires universal principles rather than relativistic accommodation. When cultures with incompatible practices concerning women's rights, religious freedom, or political participation come into contact, we need rational criteria for evaluation rather than mere cultural tolerance. The categorical imperative provides these criteria by testing whether particular practices can be universalized while respecting human dignity. American bioethics faces analogous challenges when cultural practices conflict with medical standards designed to protect patient autonomy and welfare. Some cultural traditions encourage family decision-making that excludes patient input, while others mandate procedures that medical professionals consider harmful. These conflicts require principled resolution based on universal respect for rational autonomy rather than uncritical cultural accommodation. The technology sector confronts similar issues when global platforms must navigate different cultural approaches to privacy, free expression, and community standards. Relativistic approaches lead to incoherent policies that treat identical behaviors differently based solely on cultural context, undermining the equal dignity that rational beings deserve regardless of cultural background. Corporate ethics provides another arena where relativism proves inadequate. Should multinational corporations adopt different labor standards in different countries based on local cultural practices? The categorical imperative reveals that practices violating worker dignity cannot be justified by cultural acceptance. Universal principles of fair treatment and workplace safety reflect rational requirements rather than mere Western cultural preferences. These contemporary applications demonstrate that cultural relativism, far from promoting tolerance and diversity, actually abandons the rational tools necessary for distinguishing between cultural practices that deserve respect and those that violate human dignity. Only universal principles grounded in practical reason can provide the philosophical framework necessary for navigating cultural conflicts while maintaining commitment to the inherent worth of all rational beings. Conclusion. The examination of cultural relativism reveals its fundamental philosophical bankruptcy and practical destructiveness. Rather than defending tolerance and diversity, Relativism abandons the rational foundations necessary for distinguishing between cultural practices that deserve respect and those that violate human dignity. It reduces moral judgment to mere cultural preference, eliminating the possibility of moral progress, cross-cultural dialogue, and rational critique of harmful practices. The categorical imperative provides the rational alternative that preserves both moral universality and cultural diversity by testing practices against principles that respect the dignity of all rational beings. Cultural variation in moral practices reflects different attempts to implement universal principles, not proof that no universal principles exist. The task of practical reason is to distinguish between cultural expressions of genuine moral insight and cultural distortions of universal moral law. Contemporary challenges in American society, from religious freedom to bioethics to corporate responsibility, require principled moral analysis rather than relativistic evasion. Only by maintaining commitment to universal principles grounded in rational autonomy can we navigate cultural conflicts while preserving the inherent dignity that belongs to every human being. The choice before us is clear: surrender to the arbitrary authority of cultural conditioning, or embrace the rational freedom that enables genuine moral agency. The former path leads to moral nihilism disguised as tolerance. The latter preserves the possibility of ethical progress through disciplined application of practical reason to the urgent moral questions of our time.